Good morning, everyone. Uh, we stand on January 21st, 2025, 21 Teves. And there's This morning, we're going to look at the subject relating to civil or uncivil disobedience. We're familiar very much with the concept civil disobedience. Certainly in the aftermath yesterday being Martin Luther King Day, in terms of protests, and we see it all the time. We've been living in very busy times where people are not shy about sharing their views or about protesting their views. Sometimes, we will read about a protest. Most recently, you read in Israel about a protest for or against judicial reform, or for against a hostage agreement. And you'll read about a number of people getting arrested, because sometimes you'll read about the police declaring a protest illegal and the people there violating the law. And that would mean that they can be arrested for doing so. Not sure about anyone's protesting experiences. I do remember my years in Israel, 93, 94, 95 period, were right in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords being signed. There were a lot of protests. Often our yeshiva, Karabiavna, was near what was called Somet Ashdod, which was the road that led into Gaza. At the time, Gaza was a place that people went fairly frequently. And there would be protests protesting the Oslo Accords, which were already designated as moving Gaza into being under Palestinian Authority self-rule. There were protests in what was called Somet Aza. And the protests in Somet Aza often involved burning tires in Somet Aza. We would go, and that was where we would be. Sometimes the police would come, and whether or not everyone would vacate in advance. I remember other protests where the police horses would race right through because the protests have been declared illegal, and those who stick around for too long could find themselves getting arrested. We know this was done often in the Soviet Jewry movement, which we'll come back to a little bit later. And even more recently, different protests for Jewish causes. Sometimes what would happen is that there'd be an arrangement that the protests, which would block the entrance to the UN or block the street outside the UN, there'd be kind of an arrangement between the protesters and the police. The police would declare would allow the protesters on and to block things, and then they would declare it illegal, and people would go, would vacate, or sometimes there would be kind of a pro forma the police removing the protesters but then letting them go. Lots of we're familiar with the concept of protesting. That sometimes it could be against the law. This is civil disobedience. But what happens when things get a little bit uncivil? And that's the topic this morning. It was a piece in the JTA from January 10th, source number 1. It was a rabbi and his son were arrested for vandalizing a swastika mural. Are they heroes or hooligans? The subject of our topic, of our discussion. Zechariah Meller, and it's a very long article. You can look it up yourselves, but this is a selection from it. Zechariah Meller wanted to see the swastika for himself. It was September, and Milwaukee was abuzz over a mural that had gone up on the side of a commercial building in the city's 6th district. Painted on slabs of vinyl affixed to the brick, the mural, a large rectangle about the size of the building's ground floor, featured a background that appeared to depict mass graves, weeping mothers, drones, and other scenes of carnage in Gaza. At the center, a Jewish star with a swastika inside it, along with the words, "The irony of becoming what you once hated." Any doubts that Meller had about whether the mural was anti-Semitic were erased when he visited the site, and he said, "So anti-Zionist protesters harassing Orthodox Jewish teenagers." So Meller, a 42-year-old dreadlocked former tech worker known as Z, who used to work as a kosher caterer and run a blog about kosher food, said he decided to take matters into his own hands. On the night of September 14th, he recruited his 74-year-old father, Peter, a retired rabbi who was in poor health, to accompany him to the site of the mural. They brought an axe, a sledgehammer, and a pry bar and went to work. Moving quickly, the two struck the mural and pulled the vinyl plates off the wall in full view of out-of-security cameras. Zachariah turned to one and flipped it off. Double middle fingers, the police report would later read. The pair were derailed, and the incident nearly veered into violence when a bystander who supported the mural tried to intervene. So Zachariah Meller returned the following day to finish the job, prying the remaining panels from the wall. 2 weeks later, shortly before Rosh Hashanah, police came to his home. He and his father were arrested and charged with criminal damage to property, which in Wisconsin carries up to 9 months of jail time. Meller says he knows that what he and his father did was illegal. In fact, he expected to get caught, but he's convinced he did the morally correct thing, the only option that didn't require them to ignore or shrink from a threat. The leader of a group called Beitar US, which advocates for Jews to become more forceful, even physical, in confronting the threats they see, invited the father and son to represent the organization of Milwaukee. The group also helped raise nearly $20,000 toward their legal fees. My politics and Beitar's politics are very different. I'm not a right-wing guy, Zachariah Meller said, but he said the group's president, the Jewish Public Relations Executive Ron Tarazian, assured him, this is more about, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist? The Jews have a right to live in peace. Of utmost importance, he said, was that Jews should stop just being meek and allowing ourselves to be threatened and walked over. So I said, sure. Tarazian has called the Mellers heroes. He said in an interview that their actions perfectly fit the nonprofit's vision of seeing Jews publicly fighting back against perceived threats to themselves or Israel. Representative for the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, Jewish Community Relations Council, reiterated the Federation's denunciation of the mural as anti-Semitic for many reasons, including that it promotes Holocaust and now dehumanizes survivors and victims of the Holocaust. But the groups declined to comment further on the Mellers case or the mural's actual removal. The groups have in the past discouraged Jewish vigilantism. In May, amid intense activity at the UWM encampment, the JCRC advised local Jews not to counter-protest, saying it could escalate a risky situation. So here we have the article. I don't know if any of you heard about this case. It seems that it has not really been picked up as an issue that has been commented upon and the like. But we see here a situation where a hateful symbol was countered by a not just a protest but a violent act. Particularly the idea of swastikas are often defended as a symbol of free speech. Free speech can be hate speech, but it's free speech, and interfering with free speech is certainly something. In America, we believe in free speech. But what happens when the free speech runs up against a person's strong, morally held convictions that this is wrong and has to be addressed? And we saw people took the law into their own hands, willfully, purposely violated local law, American law, took action, and it remains to be seen. The article it mentions that there's a new DA in Milwaukee. He's not sure the charges will be continued to be pressed. In this case, it was the Jews acting forcefully. What would happen if it were the shoe was on the other foot and it was something Jewish that had been defaced by someone not Jewish who was insulted by it? We would probably scream and demand the full implementation or prosecuting to the fullest extent of the law. So we see also the idea that some Jewish organizations, Beitar, encourages or supports this behavior. We know the mainstream organizations seem to shy away from confrontational behavior or supporting it. So I wanted to look at some of the ideas within Jewish sources to talk about responding to one's moral convictions by breaking the law. Questions, comments, reactions on the story itself before we dive into some of the Jewish sources. Yes. Just 1 second.
I was just always sort of told that every crime is a sin, but not every sin is a crime. Every crime is a sin.
Correct. Look. Also, who's defining right? Crime is a crime. Is a law. And then you have dina de malchus dina. What about violating the law of the land? Right. So dina de malchus dina sometimes turns a crime into a sin. And look, the subject. When looking into the subject, civil disobedience is something that is the topic that has the most textual tradition, Jewish sources, non-Jewish sources. Martin Luther King, we're going to see a quote from Gandhi, right? The idea of breaking the law when you feel something, there's a more important principle at stake, or committing a crime of civil disobedience when you think something more is at stake, has religious value. It won't necessarily be a sin. But how far does that go when it turns more violent? So I think that I would imagine all of us would think if it's violent, it has to be prohibited. Okay, but I think we've seen some civil disobedience can sometimes turn into uncivil disobedience, and I think we've even seen cases within the Jewish community, certainly within Israel, that actions that get taken that sometimes turn violent that seem to be with the approbation or the acquiescence or agreement, maybe even encouragement of religious values. I read this article and I'm somewhat sympathetic. It's an interesting case because the individual doing this is not necessarily someone who if you read the whole article isn't sort of like your mainstream Jewish communal professional, right? He's a big, tall, dreadlock Jewish caterer, kosher blogger type of a person, and he takes his 74-year-old father who's been pretty much homebound for 10 years out to do this. It's not your typical headline, but I'm sympathetic. I don't want to see a swastika in my neighborhood with something like this. So let's dive into it. And this is something that a number of people have noted. Jewish authors, religious or just even commentators. Jeff Jacoby from the Boston Globe noted this a couple of years back. It's actually timely from the Parshas HaShavua about civil disobedience, right? The story that we just read about Shifra and Pua. Source 2, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shifra, the other was Pua, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. Midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, and let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth. And God dealt with the midwives, and the people dealt well with them. He rewarded them. The people multiplied and increased greatly. Here you have Shifra and Pua, Miriam and Yocheved, refusing to follow the royal edict, and they stood fast to their convictions and in a display of civil disobedience. So, this idea of there being a certain nonconformist streak or willingness to stand up streak seems to exist, within the Jewish tradition, right? We sometimes see that, look, today, tradition and faith are sometimes countercultural themes. But we see that this civil disobedience and willingness to protest appears in a couple of examples, a couple of sources from the Talmud. Source number 3, Rosh Hashanah 19a. On the 28th of Adar, the good tidings came to the Jews that they should not turn away from the Torah. And on that day, fasting is forbidden. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah is describing something that was called Megillat Ta'anit, which was a scroll of important dates that were either commemorative for happier occasions and also sometimes listed some sadder occasions. So on the 20th of Adar, the good tidings came to the Jews that they should not turn away from the Torah, and on that day fasting is forbidden. And this is explained. For the wicked kingdom, issued a decree against Israel that they should not occupy themselves with Torah study, and that they should not circumcise their sons, and that they should desecrate the Shabbos. Why did Yehuda ben Shmuel and his colleagues do so? They went. What did Yehuda ben Shmuel and his colleagues do? They went and took advice from a certain matron, whom all the prominent men of Rome would visit regularly, thinking that she would know how to annul the decree. Right? When you want something done, you ask a woman. So she said to them as follows: cry out, hafginu, hafgana, which is a modern Israeli term for a protest. Hafgana at night in the streets and markets. They went and cried out at night, saying, "Oh heavens, are we Jews not your brothers? Are we not children of one father? Are we not children of one mother? How are we different from every other nation until you should such harsh decrees against us?" And indeed, the decrees were annulled, and the sages made that day a festive day. So we have mention of a situation where there was something that the Jews were trying to fight off, a decree. They protested against it. They had a hafgana, and in fact, they were successful in overcoming the decree. So if something is happening, rise up and protest against it. Another example, the idea also that this veers into the realm of protesting or stopping bad behavior on the part of fellow Jews, or protesting the issue is called tochacha, giving reproof or giving musar. But source number 4, Shabbat 54b, anyone who had the capability to effectively protest the sinful conduct of the members of his household did not protest, he himself is apprehended for the sins of the members of his household and punished. If he's in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the people of his town, he fails to do so, he is apprehended for the sins of the people of his town. If he's in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the whole world and he fails to do so, he's apprehended for the sins of the whole world. You have to speak out. Rav Papa said the members of the household of the exilarch, this was the Reish Galusa, this was the person who was the political head of the Jewish diaspora. So those family members were apprehended and punished for the sins of the whole world, because their authority extends across the Jewish world. It's in their hands to ensure that nobody committed transgression. You have to stand up, and you have to call out bad behavior. You have to protest it. And this is merged with the theme of tochacha, but it's actually mentioned as a religious requirement. Shulchan Aruch, Yordei 157:1, where the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, writes, source 6, when Chazal said that anyone who has the ability to protest and does not, he is seized in the same sin, right? If you're culpable if you can protest but don't. Here, where there's a chance of danger, he does not need to give up his money over this, but there's a limit. And so on the one hand, this is something that is part of Jewish law that you have to protest. At the same time, but if there's going to be some type of threat, if there's going to be a cost, if there's going to be a physical cost, a monetary cost, then sometimes the obligation is suspended. So you have to protest if it's feasible. If it's not feasible, and that requires further elucidation, then you don't have to protest. So almost we learned from the fact that there's an exception to the obligation to protest. We're learning that there is an obligation to protest. And what is the cost? Maybe there's only an obligation when it's legal to protest. If it's illegal, there'll be a price to pay for protesting and breaking the law. There'll be a penalty, civil, financial, jail time. Maybe you don't have to, but in general, ideally, all things being equal, in a perfect world, bad behavior has to be protested and stopped through that type of protest. And this idea of there being a price to pay or laws broken, that's what emerged with regards to the whole movement of civil disobedience. Thoreau wrote about in the 19th century. Here's just a brief definition from Gandhi's book, Nonviolent Resistance, source number 7. He who resorts to civil disobedience obeys the laws of the state to which he belongs, not out of fear of sanctions, but because he considers them to be good for the welfare of society. But there are some occasions, generally rare, when he considers certain laws to be so unjust as to render obedience to them a dishonor. He then openly and civilly breaks them and quietly suffers the penalty for their breach. This idea that it's nonviolent, quietly violating. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs spoke about this in an interview that's on his website. Source number 8, I think protest has to be very, very carefully nonviolent, because the second protest becomes violence, you lose. I mean, there's just it's a no-win scenario unless you're prepared to do a Russian Revolution of 1917 all over again. So protest works when it touches on something that everyone can understand and that people feel I have a shared responsibility with. And I've engaged in protest on many occasions. I think by and large, protest does have an effect, unless it's too extreme, unless it's asking for things that are really or simply beyond us as a society. But other than that, stand up and protest. The idea of civil disobedience.
It's like back in the day of Avi Weiss, my father-in-law was there at the same time. We remember they were chained, but they were civilly protesting, and it reverberates to motivating people. You have to stand up for your right, but as long as it's a quiet protest, sort of.
So there's the idea of protest, even when there's a price to be paid, even when there's a law broken, but still it should be in a sense nonviolent. Rabbi Sachs recognizes that for this type of civil disobedience to be effective, there has to be kind of a broader understanding that it's an important issue. And sometimes there's a dispute over the issue. Someone who writes about this, you don't have so many halachic responsa about civil disobedience, although we're going to look at a couple of cases where there was some halachic discussion. One of them was around the Gaza disengagement. where there was a lot of protesting, and there was also even protests that turned into not only were the protests, sometimes get violent, but there was protests over whether or not law should be followed. Right, in the Gaza disengagement, there was a debate in the religious Zionist community about soldiers disobeying orders,
Right.
and the like. So within that discussion, some of the rabbis started to talk about these types of issues. We need to protest, and sometimes there's a price to be paid, and sometimes you have to be willing to pay that price. One of the people who wrote about that was Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin. He's the late husband of Rabbanit Chana Henkin from Nishmat. His grandfather was Rabbi Eliyahu Henkin from the Lower East Side. So he wrote a number of articles in 2005 about it, but he also has a response in his Trials of Jews B'nai Banim that was asked about what about protesting for Soviet Jews. So we know Soviet Jews, a protest isn't necessarily illegal, but some of the protests during the Soviet Jewry movement were illegal. They were not violent, but they were illegal. So someone was asking, what about going in that direction? Protesting, in general, or protests that could sometimes be against the law. So he writes, source number 9, Masha Shalta al She'efad me'irgunei harabani b'artzos habris pirsam isur lahafgin b'shem Rav Moshe Feinstein. There was an organization that said, Rav Moshe Feinstein says it's forbidden to protest on behalf of Soviet Jews. Another group said Rabbi Soloveitchik endorsed the protest. We learn about Hafgana from the Gemara. We saw a couple of sources. You have to think about what's the purpose. Will there be any positive outcome from the protest? You can't, this is not a halachic debate. This is about the reality of the situation, and you certainly can't rely upon what rabbis may have said 10 years before. Certainly you asked him in 1981. The larger rallies were later in the 80s. I heard the same thing from his son-in-law. His father-in-law would not prohibit them today. Remember, Moshe has now passed away. We're trying to intuit what he would say based on what he said previously. And Rabbi Henkin says you can't do that. You can't say that he would have allowed it. You can't say he'd forbid it today. He opposed protests in the past few months. The way he understood Russia then. Maybe things have changed. Right, and so the Soviet Jewry movement in terms of protests, developed in the early 60s already. Whether or not there should be protests on behalf of Soviet Jewry, you had those who felt it would just antagonize the Soviets more. This was a position that was articulated by Rabbi Pinchas Teitz from Elizabeth, New Jersey, who was very active in trying to support the Soviet Jews by more quiet means about people going to Russia, bringing religious objects and the like. He ran up against the what was called the Triple SJ, the student struggle for the survival of Soviet Jewry, which was organized by some of the younger Americanized students of the time. A lot of them were connected with Yeshiva University. There was a difference of opinion. Another figure who was very against protests was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was more interested in the spiritual, religious survival of the Soviet Jews, in particular because Chabad had a genuine, active network of religious life, clandestinely, secretly in the Soviet Union. But on the one hand, this was rabbinical voices were heard on all the different sides, and Rabbi Henkin points out sometimes it's you don't know. Times have changed. So take that forward to the realities of further issues. 1993 Oslo, 2005 disengagement, 2023, 2024 hostage deals. It's something that it does not necessarily have a clear cut response, other than there is a religious imperative to protest when there's an important issue. Just a couple other situations where religious viewpoints were expressed for or against protesting. There was Rabbi Breitowitz is writing about the desecration of graves in Eretz Yisrael. Right, you dig in Israel, you're going to find history, and sometimes you're going to find cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, Christian cemeteries, Arab cemeteries. So often, in the expansion of certain neighborhoods or building roads, they find Jewish cemeteries, and there are those who feel that you basically have no other recourse but to stop and build a very inefficient road in order to maintain the integrity of these graves. Others say the contemporary needs override that. You'll have to move the remains. So Breitowitz writes, source number 10, over the past 30 years, organization comprised almost exclusively of Haredim has organized protests and demonstrations at a number of archaeological sites. Some of these demonstrations have resulted in pushing, shoving, rock throwing, some arrest allegations of police brutality, as well as Chil Hashem. Right, these rallies, and we see the similar reports of different rallies today against the Haredi draft possibilities. These rallies are turning violent. Well, maybe you shouldn't have them in the first place. If this is what happens at such protests, and they're going to turn to Chil Hashem, isn't that a example of an inappropriate rally that's going to lead to a violation? Well, maybe if you feel strongly enough, it's not a violation. But so then we get into what's considered a violation, right? If there's a machlokas, one person's violation is one person's just cause.
Well, in Gush Katif, they actually, sorry for interrupting, for Gush Katif, they were actually, some were very quiet. They just didn't leave their homes, but the resistance was already considered the crime of, they were being arrested.
Right, but that's Gandhi, Sachs, MLK, that's civil disobedience. Breaking the law, and it seems that there is if there's a price to pay for a just protest, you can pay that price, right? We saw before from the Ramah, you don't have to pay that price. But what happens when the civil disobedience turns uncivil in an active way? Does that negate or limit the legitimacy of such actions? And maybe if protests automatically lead to seem to devolve into shoving, rock throwing, Chil Hashem, maybe there shouldn't be a protest in the first place. Or and we see, for example, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Shulchan Aruch in Choshen Mishpat 348:1, source 11. It is forbidden to steal, even if it is a small amount according to the judgment of the Torah, and it's forbidden to steal, even if it's in a playful manner, even in the condition of returning it in order to repay double or in order to cause pain. Everything is forbidden in order not to accustom himself to this. So the idea of stealing, or what about take it in terms of damaging, take our example, destroying someone else's property to make a moral statement, even if it's a positive statement, you destroyed it. You can't do that. You can't damage, you can't steal. There are no exceptions to this. And there's an interesting application of this was Rabbi Yehuda Sherpin, who wrote an article about the Boston Tea Party. Would the Boston Tea Party be okay according to Jewish law? And he says, the bottom line, civil disobedience is allowed when protesting laws that the Torah deems unjust, or when protesting against a non-sovereign government, but vandalizing another person's property is not condoned. Now, the idea of what's considered a just law, there's a discussion, a deeper textual discussion with regards to what Miriam raised at the very beginning about dina d'machus dina, right? It could be a sin but not a crime. Or what if it's what if it's also, if it's a crime, does that make it a sin? Is something that dina machus dina may introduce to the discussion. And there is an approach amongst certain halachic authorities that dina d'malchus dina, if it's a law of the land, and again, the law of the land introduced by a sovereign, non-tyrannical, non-oppressive regime that has laws and treats all of its subjects fairly, when it comes to issues of commerce or issues of property and finance, then Jews have to follow that. So the suggestion is raised that maybe it's possible that a Jew has to follow these laws, but the fact that if a Jew decides to violate and subject themselves to the penalties, that is a crime but not a sin. When there's this type of thrust to purposely violate to make the statement, you shouldn't do it, and you're now subject appropriately so to penalty, but it doesn't have the religious component to it. Not really sure what the difference is. There could still be reverberations of Chil Hashem and the like, but if you want to take the Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishra 348.1, that you can't violate the law, period. You can't even pretend. You can't even do it for non-personal gain. You can't even pretend to steal. You can't do anything like that. Well, that would seem to indicate that just like the Boston Tea Party would be problematic religiously, so would violating, so would vandalizing within the context of making what would seem to be a moral statement would also be problematic. But the way the rabbis understood Din Malchus Adina, that it's a law that you have to follow, but if you break, it's not necessarily a religious violation, seems to open up the possibility that we're open to encouraging civil disobedience that may lead to a little bit more than that, to the more violent consequences, or to say smash the property that is the offensive symbols or the like. And then we're going to open up one other, I guess, type of a can of discussion about, the idea of exception within Jewish law. Questions, comments, reactions before we go down that last path. So it's almost as if that we're sympathetic to protests that goes against civil law or even sometimes halacha. We're sympathetic to the Boston Tea Party. We're sympathetic to breaking the swastika, but it's not something that we would promote. We don't necessarily go down that path of encouraging that type of behavior. That more as the usual way of going about it. What about those figures who are encouraging more violent protests or more uncivil disobedience? So I think that for that we have to look at this this final approach, which is the idea of what's called, it's actually a verse in Tehillim 119 Kuf Yotes. Sometimes you have to act for the sake of the Lord. And it's introduced in the Gemara in Brachos. It says, it is time to work for the Lord. They have made void your Torah. Psalms 119:26. I.e., it is occasionally necessary to negate biblical precepts in order to perform God's will. And greeting and others, right? So this is the idea that the case in point was actually using Hashem's name to greet somebody. Right? In the Talmud, good morning is not a good morning. It's invoking God's name every time you say it. Right? So Shalom Aleichem. Shalom is one of God's names. So how can you do that? So sometimes you just have to do it. Rabbi Nathan says another interpretation of the verse, make void your Torah because it is the time to work for the Lord. Occasionally it's necessary to negate biblical precepts in order to bolster the Torah. So it's a time to act for God. And this gets introduced. We see cases in Tanakh of this, and one is Eliyahu and Har Carmel. Right? Eliyahu, when he was fighting the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, he's offering sacrifices, but the sacrifices at that time are only supposed to be offered in the Beis HaMikdash. And not once you have a Beis HaMikdash, there are no sacrifices anywhere else. So the Ravid, who comments on the Rambam, and this is in the laws of rebellious judges, so it makes sense for it to be there. If the court takes away from the observance of the commandments by necessity of the hour, like the case of Eliyahu on Mount Carmel, this too is a matter of Torah. It's time to act for God. They've made void your Torah. Right? So he's using the Eis Lasos Hashem to explain, for example, Eliyahu's behavior. Now, this is in the past. This is the prism to understand what seems to be improper or forbidden activities of Eliyahu Hanavi. On the one hand, we wouldn't want to. we would never question Eliyahu Hanavi, but the Rav still says we have to have a category to explain how this non-legal antinomian behavior takes place. How does this get understood? Can this be a prescription to go forward? So the short answer is yes, but generally in areas of Jewish law where there's either multiple approaches can be taken, or we're not talking about, we don't like to rank which halachas are more important than others, but it's not as impactful, right? We're not talking about we're going to allow people to worship idols or flagrantly violate communal norms or religious expectations. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein invokes it in source number 15, Bidavar, Scranton, Pennsylvania. The Jewish day school is shrinking, is losing students. They're moving from Scranton, they're moving to the big cities. For other reasons. They have only 81 students. The 81 total students, they have a very small number of students in each grade. Above fifth grade, 7 or 8 in each grade. If you divide it up between the boys and the girls so that you could have them study separately, there are only 4 boys, 4 girls, 5 boys. Sometimes it'll be 3, and this won't work. You're going to have to spend more money. They can't afford it. Right? It's already costing a lot. And it will cost more than schools in other places. People will keep moving. People know my opinion, and I feel that halachically speaking, you should divide even younger grades. In New York, like we do in New York. In other cities where it's difficult, Moshe Feinstein says in places where they ask me whether they can combine boys and girls in classes, I said no in those situations because they should be separated, certainly above 5th grade. But Scranton, in Scranton, this number of students is so small, you can't do it and you have smaller classes. And you're going to combine 5th and 6th grades and have the boys and girls separated in 7th and 8th grades. It's not good. Most parents won't agree to this. I'm actually thinking when I was in 7th and 8th grade, when I was in those grades, we did actually have 7th and 8th grade boys together for Jewish studies. I guess they went the extra mile. But you can't separate boys and girls. But to stop it and to have the kids go to non-Jewish schools is even worse. Scranton is unique. They can't separate the boys and the girls. So, Rav Moshe is saying, according to my interpretation of halacha, my psak is they have to be separated, but they can't be separated. So we're going to act for the Lord and go against the din in this case. Okay, maybe co-education is not the same as idolatry, or co-education is not the same as offering sacrifices outside the Beis Hamikdash, but that is maybe so is protesting that leads to breaking of someone's property. Another example of Eis Lasos Lashem is invoked by Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, a very famous discussion that he had about youth groups and about boys and girls singing together. In this case, where there's not a complete prohibition, only a pious custom and a measure of modesty, it's possible to learn from our neighbors who permit in France, where the situation of Judaism has already reached a crisis. Right? He was asked about the Yeshurun group in Germany, about boys and girls singing together. And he says, in France, they've done this, and they did this because they had to. Therefore, I root for the leaders of the Yeshurun organization that may rely on the great rabbinic leaders of Germany who are expert in the science of education, to the spirit of the girls of the generation, who are educated in school and study languages and sciences, who have a sense of self-esteem and receive insult and exclusion from the community, the prohibition imposed upon them. For the participant held these mirror, the girls wanted to join in the singing. Therefore, they permitted women to participate in Shabbos miros, and we see and know that the great rabbinic leaders are generally succeeding in the education of the girls and young women more than great rabbinic leaders of other countries. And in Germany, we see learned women from the high-level location were deeply committed to the religion of Israel and fulfilled the mitzvah. Therefore, I'm not eager to forbid what they permitted there, and in such cases, a time to do for God, they violated your Torah. Right? And look, the same theme is also invoked in other places. For example, the idea of teaching women the oral Torah is mentioned explicitly in the Talmud as being inappropriate. And when the Chafetz Chaim was addressing women's education, what led to the opening of the Beis Yaakov movement, also Torah. So again, these cases aren't necessarily situations that have the same. These are not, again, we're not telling people to practice Judaism differently. We're relying on, in cases to make exceptions like Ramosha, or rely on more minority or lesser known opinions. But the idea of that with regard to protesting that may lead to a violation, maybe if the issue is important enough, you could do it. And I haven't seen authorities who talk about that, but when it comes in particular with the idea of protesting, Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch raises an interesting point when it comes to protests. Do the protests help? Do they help? And so if the protests don't help, what's the point of a protest? To make a statement. Is making a statement an important enough, is that an important enough reason to do it? And is it an important enough reason to make, Rabbi Sternbuch doesn't address this directly, but is it important enough to encourage the protest, knowing that it could devolve into certain things, to go off the rails and to lead to other violations, property damage, violence, Chil Hashem, like in the grave desecration cases or the like. So Rabbi Sternbuch is talking about, this is source number 17. There was a time, it was more prominent, there were protests about streets that were open on Shabbos and people were driving. So they would protest in the streets, and the protests themselves lead to more Chil Shabbos, because cars have to stop and start, and other Shabbos has to be violated in response to the protest that are there protesting Shabbos desecration. So he's asking, can you do this? And I think at the time Rabbi Sternbuch was living in South Africa, because he says, "Be'eretz Yisrael nogu lahakol b'zeh." In Israel, they are lenient to allow it, right? So he's not so convinced that this is something that should be encouraged or even allowed, but says they're lenient to do so in Israel. And they say it's a mitzvah to do it. You have to understand this a little bit. Right? Why? Why is this allowed? The protests are not about stopping Shabbos desecration. Because you start asking questions like, you're going to be protesting, and one of the things that comes up is that if you cause someone to step on their brakes on Shabbos and then they have to push the gas again, then they violate Shabbos another time. So maybe just stay out of their way, and there'll be less Chil Shabbos. You're going to protest against those who aren't really achicha, they're not listening to you anyway. What's the purpose? And in general, the whole idea of giving tochacha, of giving a reproof, is only when you think there's a chance you'll be listened to. So he says they allow this and they encourage this, but why? If you get deep down, what's the purpose of the protest? We have to know, and our children should appreciate after us, that Shabbos has defended us. It's really to instill within us that Shabbos is worth protesting. And so Rabbi Sternbuch introduces that the protest is because the cause is important enough that we have to take a stand. And so it could be that in some of the civil disobedience, it's not only about the changes that may be wrought, but it's the statement that's being made or the lessons that's being internalized and taught about how important the issue is. And that's what gets people out into the street, and that's what allows, potentially the risk to be taken of what may devolve further. Not condoning what happens further, but we take the risk of what can happen further. Certainly it seems the Jewish tradition, Jewish law has nothing wrong with protesting and making a statement. It seems to even, have within the room for nonviolent civil disobedience. But once things start to get more violent, and once things are broken, and once things might be stolen, or once things may be vandalized, certainly once there's more violence, it becomes more problematic. But we've seen that the A/SO/M being invoked, it may be what has allowed this to go and take a turn into this uncivil type of behavior. And at its root, it's really about showing how important some subjects are, that they deserve us to go out in the streets and to protest against them. I think that for a straight up textual defense of this, a straight up textual defense of the actions in Milwaukee, complicated. I think we're sympathetic. Don't judge another person until you walk a mile in their shoes. But it seems that this halacha Jewish sources open up some kind of a gray area where things become so necessary that hard divergence from the expected or normative behavior takes place. We can understand it, but for the most part, I think that the way that Rabbi Sachs put it in terms of the complexity and the need to stay nonviolent and is the more normative one. We should always do our best to stand up for what is right, and hopefully, our enemies will see our resolve going forward, and we don't end up in these types of situations. But it will be interesting to see how this situation in Milwaukee unfolds. Bli neder, if I hear the updates, I'll be sure to share them with everybody, and we'll move on to the next subject. Happy to hear any questions, comments, reactions, final thoughts.
Rabbi Weinstock, I don't understand 13. It is time to work for the Lord. I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
So the verse in Tehillim says sometimes you gotta break the Torah to serve the Lord, and the rabbis were willing to do so. In the case of brachos, by bandying about God's name potentially in vain as part of greeting people, or as a general statement to negate biblical precepts in order to bolster the Torah, and that became the vehicle for understanding the antinomian behavior in the Torah or in the Bible, like Eliyahu Navi, who violated the laws of sacrifice outside the Beis HaMikdash to make a statement. And then there are further examples throughout. Generally speaking, they're more innocuous and innocent, as we saw Rabbi Feinstein permit or allowing co-education as such a violation, or Rabbi Weinberg using it as a way to defend the less clear-cut violation of Kol Isha, certainly with regard to Shabbos Miros. It may be usher, but we're going to do it anyway because it's for a higher purpose to serve the Lord. But that, such a motive can then be corrupted. Maybe it's corrupted to allow violent protests, or maybe it's necessary sometimes to have violent protests. So it's certainly not a principle that has clear-cut guidance and direction. It certainly seems to be more relevant in less strident violations, but maybe to prove a point or to allow something that may go off the rails could be invoked.